Welcome to the Literacy Bug, and today we have a new presentation, but it's a little bit different than the recent presentations that we've had. For those who have followed the YouTube channel, you'll notice that our past presentations have been fairly lengthy. In many ways they've been full lectures on particular topics. And what I'm trying to do now is to present a bit of smaller presentations that also allow me to take some of the more, complex slides in the main presentations and use that particular slide as the basis for an entire presentation. In fact, what I found in the larger presentations is that we are moving through lots of content, still relatively sort of methodically, but not being able to sort of probe some of the more complex material to the degree that we'd otherwise want. So in this series of presentations, they'll be a little bit shorter, not saying short, but a little bit shorter, and we'll focus on a particular slide for discussion and some related materials, but not too much more than that main slide for investigating. So for today, what we have is a presentation on what is involved in literacy. And it relates to one of our presentations called an overview of literacy development. And what I have here on the slide that you're looking at is a YouTube link to that main presentation, if you'd like to check it out, as well as links to the slides. Now, bear in mind that the slide that we'll be discussing today about what is involved in literacy actually doesn't appear in the original presentation. It's been added in the version 2 of the slides, which is also an attempt to try to trim and focus on the main principles of the topic. So for today, we will go back to this notion of what is involved in literacy. And what we'll be talking about is the components that a child needs to grapple with in order to be able to pursue that pathway of reading and writing with increasing complexity over time. And for many of you, this will be a review of components or a reminder of making sure that one's instruction is multifaceted. But as I said before, it's also an opportunity to take some of the concepts that we presented in previous presentations and to go into further depth. So without further ado, this is the whole slide. This is the slide that we'll spend 90% of the presentation on. And so we ask this question: what is involved in literacy? That if we're saying, okay, if a child needs to have strong literacy skills, what does that mean? And for the layman, it's like, well, what that means is they have to be able to know their letters and be able to put those letters together to form words, and to be able to read those words on the page, and to be able to scan the sentences on the page, and be able to comprehend text. And that would be completely accurate. But for this purposes, we'll talk about that in what some of the research is saying out in the field. So if I use my sort of material here and I highlight, I guess, the foundation to literacy, which is language. So the first thing that at the very nature of birth, or potentially also in utero, is a child is experiencing language, and they're brought into a language-rich world, and they're engaging with and processing language far before they're engaging in print. And so what we want to make sure is that children are developing strong language skills, they're becoming language competent, that they're developing words, that they're putting words together to form sentences, and they're using language to have conversations with adults, and adults are using language to have conversations with children, and they're becoming flexible and dexterous with language, and they're able to do things with language in their environment. And they're also being able to, for those children who are living in multilingual environments, being able to grow in their mother tongue language, but also being able to transfer those skills into perhaps a second language, and becoming competent in some cases in the language of school, which may be different from the language of home. And so that capacity to be able to use language in diverse forms. And when I say language in diverse forms, what I want you to sort of imagine is, later on when children are going to be writing and reading stories or arguments or instructions or recounts, these all have their foundation in language. They hear and tell stories. They report on what's happened during the day, and they hear reports from others. They engage in discussions and debates. They review and they provide opinions. All these things that we anticipate and expect children to do in writing later on are preceded by experiencing the same forms of discourse orally between themselves and adult caretakers or with peers, etc. And what's quite seminal in the research in this area is something called the 30 million word gap, and many have probably heard of this concept before. Coined by the researchers Hart and Riesling, which they identified that some children, particularly children in higher socioeconomic status homes, heard 30 million more words upon school entry than their peers. And that meant that those children had a lot more language stimulus, heard a lot more diverse vocabulary, engaged in a lot more language around play, around meal times, etc., than their other peers. And obviously that meant they entered school, as we've said before, with a larger vocabulary, but also with a larger knowledge of how to use language and the different forms of using language. And in fact, one of the key findings that from the research that's understated is that those children who experience more language were likely to experience a stronger diversity in the types of language. In other words, both groups, the language poor group and language rich group, encountered the same amount of command language: do this, don't do this, etc. And so as a result, the larger number of words for the language-rich families wasn't made up of more command language. It was made up of more language play in the sandpit, language play in the kitchen, having conversations around the table, having conversations in the park or at the zoo, etc. So, long story short, language competency is one of the foundation elements of literacy, because language is also something that we use to communicate, but also it's how we encode and explore knowledge. Okay, so wrap a bow on that concept. In addition to language, children need to develop what is commonly known as phonemic awareness, but I'd like to broaden this out to basically awareness of the units of language. So phonemic awareness, defined strictly, is that a child is aware of sounds within words, that they know this word called water, but they not only know that there's a word called water, but it's made up of the w and the ah and the t and the sounds. And so that ability to break up a word into their fundamental sounds is a precursor to being able to attach letters that they're learning to the sounds that they know. And the more accurate they are with their phonemic awareness, the easier that they can monitor their own speech and draw a correlation between their own knowledge of speech and language with that of the squiggles on a page that they're being introduced to in late preschool and into school. But if I take a step back and focus not only just on sound awareness within words and broaden the concept to awareness of the units of language, this is when we talk about that if a child is learning language, there's certain abstract concepts in language that become physical and tangible in literacy. And one of those concepts is that there's boundaries between things. So that there's boundaries between words in a sentence, but also that there's a boundary in a sentence. So in fact, in language, there's no concept of a sentence. We talk and we talk and we talk and we talk. But on the page, it's very clear to see that a sentence starts with a capital letter and ends with a full stop. And we can see that that sentence is bound. So becoming aware of a sentence and aware that there's words also, that there's boundaries around words, that there's words that make up sentences, is awareness of these units within language. And then in addition to being aware of that there's words within sentences, that within words there are syllables. So a word like yellow has 2 syllables, and we can clap those. Yellow. And then more fine-tuned, knowing that there's the y sound at the beginning of yellow and the yellow, the o sound at the end of yellow, and it has the ul sound sort of with Ninder, etc., and then it goes down to more traditional phonemic awareness. So if we combine those two, as children, from the very age of birth, they're using language, they're being able to string together from 2-word sentences to 3-word sentences to 4-word sentences, etc. And then at some stage, and this is around ages 3, 4, 5, drawing their attention to the parts of language, being able to have language played and word play, become more and more aware of the internal constructs within words, predominantly through play-based and exploratory type focus. Meanwhile, children are becoming print aware. So as they're exploring language, they're also exploring, actually, in this environment, these adults, they start to point to things, and every time they point to a particular thing, they say the same thing. So a stop sign, a child points to a stop sign, and the parent says, "Oh, that says stop." Now, a child will point to a stop sign, a red stop sign, hexagonal, so red stop sign. That's quite ubiquitous in English-speaking countries. And they'll say stop. Now, at no stage with a young child, 3 or 4 years old, are we claiming that child is decoding the word stop in the sign, stop, because, in fact, they're just associating that whole word with that sign. Now, if we presented the word stop just by itself, it is a likelihood that the child would not call that stop. But in the context of the stop sign, that whole symbolism, that whole sort of representation is stop. Or in a picture book that's read often and often and often, there might be onomatopoeia with a word like bang, but it's highly illustrated. So there's lightning bolts coming off of the word bang. And whenever the adult reaches that page in the book and points to that item on the page and says bang, the child comes to associate that there might be some connection between that text on the page and what the adult says. Now, in no way is the child decoding as bang, but they're just drawing that association between symbol and what the adult is saying. And so that's an important concept for kids to grasp, that there's icons in the world that stand for things. So the F in Facebook, the golden arches for McDonald's, the stop sign, and so on and so on and so on. And also, key to that discovery is the concept of what a word is. And so in many ways, the very first word that a child comes to understand very clearly as a concept of a word is their own name. So when they see that name, in case my son's name is Liam, and they see Liam, and they go, that spells Liam. Then they won't draw a correlation at that time between the letters and the sounds and how those letters make up the word Liam, but they recognize that's my name. And then that becomes a springboard to exploring, there must be other words that represent things, like the letters N-O represent no. And so that they have a concept of a word, that we use words in different fonts and different orientations, but even if they appear in different fonts and different orientations, if they have the same letters, there's something stable that it says something like my name, or no, or at this stage, stop, or dog, etc. And with that, they can become curious of the inner workings of how letters and sounds work together. And the key thing is to be able to rapidly synthesize all this information. So rapidly synthesize language. These words I know, and these words have parts to them and sounds that I know. And I'm aware that, so this can be represented in print. And I'm learning these letters, and I'm able to, with greater exposure and practice and play, I'm able to very rapidly recognize my letters, very rapidly see an image of a cat and say cat, or see an image of a cloud and say cloud. And so that ability to rapidly process information, because in fact in reading, that's what the brain will need able to do, is to reach a certain stage of automaticity to be able to see through the text that one is reading and focus more on the message sort of entailed therein. Okay, so we summarize here. Language is important. Phonemic awareness is important. The key juncture between 4 to 5 years old of having a concept of what is a word, and then through that being able to investigate this link between letters and sounds that I know and how they come to construct words. Word construction and word reading, and exploring word meaning, and then the ability to read and construct sentences, so be able to read in individual words, but also to be able to use that language knowledge and the knowledge of print to be able to read sentences about the word and construct sentences about the world, to demonstrate that they have all the ingredients for reading and writing, that they could read individual words and they can read with intonation sentences that are also quite applicable to the language knowledge that they have, to both express the world around them, but also to read about their own world and other worlds. Continued with that is continuing to develop oral language skills, to continuing to have conversations, continuing to tell stories and to hear stories, continuing to have arguments and discussions, because the many forms of discourse that will form the many ways of reading, many ways of writing, first see the light of day in the interactions between people before we see those things as the interaction between the text and the reader, or the writer creating the text for another reader. And so with that foundation in line, we're focusing upon children synthesizing all that knowledge to be able to comprehend and compose texts for a variety of purposes, and being able to become competent in being able to comprehend with accuracy, a literal comprehension, the text that they read, making sure that they're attending and focusing and not just decoding, but allowing comprehension to take a back seat, but they're reading with accuracy and clarity so that they understand the message and they're extracting key information and main ideas and knowledge. And similarly, that they're composing texts with care and accuracy, adhering to the grammatical conventions, but also adhering to conventions of genre, etc. And with that sense of control, moving on to more critical analysis and evaluation, and the ability to process and express information in more and more complex sort of ways. And so that's that real shift from here into this area of learning to read to reading to learn. So that's the fundamental of this little, and in particular, small slide. And if I jump onto a couple other sort of slides, what are other relevant slides that I draw upon and only mention briefly? And from what that initial slide tells us is literacy is componential. So there's components to literacy. So we're learning oral language, learning phonemic awareness, we're learning alphabetic knowledge, spelling and decoding skills, grammatical knowledge, fluency. So there's components that children need to become sort of competent with. So literacy isn't just one thing, but it's the synthesis of many different linguistic and related skills. It's also cumulative. The more you practice, the more that the skills build, and allows teachers to extend into more complex activities that rely upon the previous activities as a base. And it's also transactional, that it involves a practice between people. So oral language really involves people having conversations. Phonemic awareness involves adults playing games and drawing children's attention to the internal workings of words. The ability to construct words and construct sentences and comprehend text isn't something that happens individually just inside the child, between the child and a text. It happens mediated by other adults in their lives, initiating them into the world of print. And I always love this quote from Woolf, that although it took 2,000 years to make the cognitive breakthrough necessary to learn to read with an alphabet, so the invention of the phonetic alphabet might have taken 2,000 years to develop, but we expect children to gain mastery of that within 2,000 days, which is up between roughly 6 and a bit years old, maybe 5 to 6 years old or so. I haven't calculated that exactly as of yet. And implied in there is it's all about gradual practice. It's not like a funnel, which is dump lots of knowledge into the individual and then expect like a computer program that it to calculate and spit out a result. But it's more like a spiral. Early skills are used as the foundation to expand into more complex skills, which are used as the foundation to expand into more complex skills. So that cumulative and gradual process of becoming more and more competent and dexterous with the written word. And that's sort of represented here, and this probably will be a slide that will form its own presentation later on, and that is across the stages of development. We see a fading over here of those skills we want children to master, so that the focus can shift towards deeper comprehension of texts, etc. And that's also represented here in this diagram, that in the early years, the focus is upon the surface level, becoming competent with letter sound knowledge, being able to access texts. But at some stage when that is mastered, the shift occurs in which there's less of a focus upon being able to learn to read, and a deeper focus upon being able to read to learn, being able to ask questions, being able to draw comparisons, to be able to apply conceptual frameworks to process texts and extract meaning in greater detail. So that's, if I go back to that, and so that was the main focus of today. So children developing language, developing the phonemic awareness, becoming word curious, using that as a basis to methodically develop that sound letter knowledge, to construct words, recognize words, to use words, and use words into really rich sentences, and to be able to read really rich sentences, and use that as then the basis to explore in text as a whole, and then as children are becoming more accurate, increasing that level of critical evaluation and analysis that goes with independent reading. Okay, which leads me to my don't forget. Now I'll be my most vocal critic in recent presentations, because one thing I want to mention here is, and everyone on the site knows that I have a little bit of a fascination with Ludwig Wittgenstein. He had this quote that said that we feel that even when all possible scientific questions have been answered, the problems of life remain completely untouched. So in other words, I've provided a fairly theoretical or provided the scientific sort of knowledge around what is involved in learning to read. And even if one has that framework, these are the skills that children need to develop to become competent sort of readers and writers and speakers and listeners. That doesn't solve the problem. The major problem is now that we have that knowledge, how within the stream of life, how do we in everyday life rich and engaging activities so children are growing, so children are developing in their language, that they're developing in the phonemic awareness, that they're encountering words and letters and sounds, and they're putting them together with other words to say things about the world and to experience things in the world. So, we can lay out a framework of what's involved in literacy, but that doesn't, that's unlike the medical sciences, it doesn't become a vaccine for all future generations. And that's because every child growing up needs to, on their own, with the support of those around them, develop the skills of literacy. In life, we have to find ways to encourage that growth. I hope that makes sense. Or in other words, learning the rules or principles intellectually, as we're doing here, is not equivalent to mastering the practice. For that would require knowing how to use and apply them in all the inarticulate details of the practice. So I want you to take that these sort of concepts and say, how am I going to apply them? How can I use them so that, and how can I sort of picture them on a daily basis with real children? And that is what will make the difference. Or in other words, I feel like that sometimes the work of the teacher consists of marshalling reminders for a particular purpose. In many ways, I expect many of the people who are watching this video to already know what is contained in it. That in fact, this is more just providing some reminders and saying, what you know in the back of your head is true. That we need to balance the development of these skills. In fact, I'm not telling you anything new. In fact, I'm more trying to just remind you to stay the course and to keep that instruction rich and diverse and developmental. So without further ado, sort of thank you. It's probably a simpler sort of slide to unpack than others to come, but as I try to stay on the focus of brevity, I'll leave it there. So in the meantime, feel free to visit our website, www.literacybug.com, write us an email, visit the YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, and we look forward to engaging in the future. Thank you.